15 years ago, at the age of 19, an artist by the name of Nasir Jones released his debut album, Illmatic. The Source awarded it 5 mics, and the album was hailed as an instant masterpiece. It only had 10 tracks, but each one displayed not only his lyrical genius, but also a surprising level of musical maturity. Now, 15 years later, Michael Eric Dyson, Sohail Daulatzai, and other writers have written a book on the album. It's titled Born to Use Mics, Reading Nas's Illmatic. In the book, each writer focuses on an individual track and looks into its cultural significance. Sohail Daulatzai, welcome to And You Don't Stop on WBAI. So, why Illmatic? Why not Ready to Die or Hard to Earn by Gangsta or any of those albums that came out in '94?
That's a really good question. I mean, me and Mike, when we were deciding which book to do, we had a few, and it was really interesting. I mean, the ones that you put out there, obviously all those came out in '94, but for us it was like a choice between, Illmatic and Nation of Millions, America's Most Wanted by Ice Cube. That there are these particular records that we felt like really signaled a sea change, not only in hip hop or in music more generally, but kind of like in terms of the commentary that it was making on the U.S. more broadly. And we just felt like that while those other albums were great albums and they were really hard to not do a book on, that Illmatic became the choice for us because of the particular moment in which it occurred, which was this moment in 1994, this moment where hip hop was, as we talked about, as I argued in the introduction, kind of at this tipping point. It was this post kind of Dr. Dre, the Chronic album had just come out, Snoop had just come up on the West Coast, and hip-hop seemed to be in a different place or shifting into a different direction than it had been in that late 80s, early 90s moment. Not necessarily a moment of innocence in hip-hop, but definitely a moment in which there was kind of a social commentary, a particular kind of aesthetic involved in hip-hop in terms of like the kinds of sampling, James Brown, etc. But that it had a certain kind of, like, as Chuck called it, a black CNN feel to it. There was a certain kind of public sphere with which hip-hop was creating for itself. And Illmatic occurred at this moment, and you can tell by listening to Nas, like, on the album, which is what makes the album such an incredible album for a lot of reasons, that he was deeply influenced by that era. And so he was this MC who grew up, cut his teeth on that era that's called the golden age, so to speak, in hip-hop. Yeah, but was trying to do something different, so that the album wasn't this traditionally political hip-hop album. But it wasn't apolitical either. For us, what really grabbed our attention, in addition to all of that, was this kind of like first-person narrative that Nas was trying to rap from. It was a certain kind of like, it was almost like, like a Raymond Chandler novel, Chester Himes, etc. It was like this kind of hard-boiled realism that Nas was trying to get at. And as I mentioned in the introduction, it was also very cinematic. I mean, it was an album that was on the one hand documentary, but there were elements to it that were like science fiction. And so this MC who, at the same time, at the age of 19, when he does Live at the Barbecue, catches this huge underground buzz, not only in New York, but out here on the West Coast as well when I was in L.A. So it was this guy that people kept on following. There was this attention. There was this kind of this aura surrounding Nas. There was this kind of like second coming of Rakim that we felt that was like, when it came to Illmatic, like Nas didn't fail to deliver. And obviously when you look at the producers that are on the album as well, Premier, Pete Rock, Large Pro, Q-Tip, and LES as well. Not to mention the remixes by Buck Wild and Large Professor and Q-Tip and those guys. I mean, the album just had, and the remixes with it, it was just such a body of work that it forced you to contend with so much. And then, of course, looking back on it, if you think about the MCs over the last 15 or 20 years, if you want to call it that have continued to stay, and I hate to use the word relevant because they're all relevant, but if you think about an MC that continued to remain within a certain kind of sphere of visibility for a variety of different reasons and continued to be provocative, the only one you could really point the finger to was Nas.
I was thrown off by Nas. I was like, he's not talking about what I want him to talk about. Right. The Firm eventually came around, and that just kind of threw me for a loop. Do you think Nas peaked too early? Do you think people followed his lead? Well, I guess what changed in hip-hop after Nas?
No, I think that's a really good question. And again, that goes back to like the first question that you were asking, which is, again, why Illmatic and why Nas? Again, because I think through this one figure, through this one artist, like, you can trace so much of hip-hop's history. I mean, there was a point, you're right, where Nas admittedly, when you talk about kind of the I Am period and the Nostradamus period, where Nas, supposedly lost his way. A very underrated record is his second album, It Was Written. And so you can trace through Nas, when we say lost his way, like, it's this kind of puffy, kind of like bling era hip hop that kind of like by the late 90s was, the dominant in many ways. Mm-hmm. And in many ways, Nas kind of, I wouldn't say fell victim to it, but you can start to see him begin to dabble within that as well. And so I guess people started to second guess Nas and wonder like, oh man, where's the Nas of Illmatic? Where's the Nas who rapped about, Uzi in my army jacket lining? You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like with that kind of like keen perspective on the world. But I think Nas redeems himself clearly, and I think, there's a lot of things that are happening at that time, at that point in life. And he's having to contend with his mother's illness and ultimate death. Jay-Z's kind of battle attack on him that I think when you look at kind of like the Stillmatic to God's Son, to then, obviously Hip Hop is Dead, and then, his more recent album work that he's going to be doing with Damian Marley, I mean, you can begin to see Nas beginning to redeem himself and starting to kind of recenter himself as the kind of the great MC that everyone expected him to be. So was Illmatic his best album? Did he decline after that? I don't know. I mean, I think, I like the fact that there's this almost a genre of hip-hop, almost if you want to call it that, called like kind of grown man hip-hop. We have to allow the genre to breathe, and we have to allow these MCs to grow. And, while Illmatic was such an incredible album, it was an album of its time. And while it continues to, in many ways, be timeless, I think Nas as an artist, especially over the last, 6 or 7 years, I think, has, continued to put out consistently the best hip-hop out there. But I think, like, we have to also put it in context, and that gets to the second part of your question was, has hip-hop changed since Illmatic? And I would say definitely, and I think that was, again, part of the reason why we wanted to do it. We saw, you began to see hip-hop, the ground underneath his feet beginning to shift. You began to see the ideas around excess and spectacle, like this crass materialism that was beginning to dominate the genre at a mainstream level. That's not to say that on the kind of more, I hate to use the word underground, but on the level that wasn't operating in terms of like radio and television, cats were still putting it down at a level that harkened back to that late 80s, early 90s period. But in terms of like what hip hop had become, it became commercial jingle. But to me, that in many ways, if we want to look for a silver lining in that, it created a space for all these other MCs to continue to do the great work that they do. And it forced you in many ways, like it was back in the day with hip-hop, especially out here on the West Coast. Like, hip-hop wasn't so easily accessible for a long period of time. You had to go out and look for it. And I feel like in many ways, like, that's the same case today and over the last few years. Like, if you want to look for the hip-hop that's still saying something, you got to kind of look for it, and when you find it, it's really rewarding in that regard.
When the Nas's album came out, I was like 14 years old.
Right.
But, after reading it and then going back through Nas's discography, I kind of see that struggle, that the growing pains that he's going through as an artist.
Absolutely. I mean, he makes Illmatic the Illmatic comes out when he's 21, but he's recording it when he's 19, 18, 18, 19, 20 years old. So he's a young man, and he's coming up at this, really fertile period in hip-hop, and there's a lot of pressure to, at the end of the day that was put on Nas after Illmatic. I mean, is he going to deliver? And like I said, it was written was still a great album, but, here's this guy who, as you say, is going through these growing pains, and I think, like, I wish he hadn't gone through them, but what if he hadn't gone through them? Would he be making the records that he is today? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. So in many ways, like, it is what it is, but you get to see, like, I mean, and no one, his last album, the Untitled record, which, to me was a brilliant album. Probably one of the best albums to come out in hip hop in the 2000s. I think, in terms of like the timeliness of it. I mean, you have this moment where Barack Obama's running for president, and Nas comes out with the album with that title, and everyone knew what the name of what the album was, and with that kind of content. Like, I mean, there's something, and it's not just about being provocative to sell records, especially in this era of downloading. I mean, I think that Nas is really trying to, he takes the genre and the art very seriously. He's a purist in that regard. And John Caramanica wrote in the book as well, in his piece, that Nas can only almost in many ways blame himself for where hip-hop is today. That was his argument, at least, John Caramanica's. That is to say that, Nas is kind of coming off as kind of like the curmudgeonly old man in some ways relative to contemporary hip-hop that's coming out today. And that's fine, but I think, like, the points that he's trying to make and the arguments that he's making, like I said, he's still at this place where he's relevant, where even younger people, I mean, I have a lot of students. I mean, I teach at a university, and they still follow Nas. He's one of those guys from that era, who they still follow religiously because I think of Illmatic. There's still always that hope that, Illmatic is going to come back, that there's going to be these glimpses of what Illmatic was show up in his later in his recordings, and I think there's always elements of that. And so, Nas is still Nas to me. You know what I mean?
The book is Born to Use Mics, Reading Nas's Illmatic. Contributing editors Michael Eric Dyson, and you just heard Sohail Daulatzai, with other contributors such as Mark Anthony Neal, Guthrie Ramsey, Imani Perry, and Common. Pick up the book, re-listen to Nas's Illmatic, and experience greatness again. Sohail Daulatzai, thanks for joining us on And You Don't Stop on WBAI New York.
It's yours. Whose world is this? It's mine, it's mine, it's mine. Whose world is this? It's yours. It's mine, it's mine, it's mine. Whose world is this? It's mine, it's mine, it's mine. Whose world is this? Say what? Say what? Whose world is this? It's yours. It's mine, it's mine, it's mine. Whose world is this? It's mine, it's mine, it's mine. Whose world is this? It's yours. It's mine, it's mine, it's mine. Whose world is this? It's mine, it's mine, it's mine. Whose world is this? It's yours. It's mine, it's mine. Whose world is this? It's mine, it's mine, it's mine. Whose world is this? It's yours. It's mine, it's mine, it's mine. Whose world is this? It's mine, it's mine, it's mine. Whose world is this? It's yours. It's yours. It's mine, it's mine. Whose world is this? It's yours. It's mine, it's mine, it's mine.